We're all confused. We're like version 2. Half and half. Looking for giant Patriots flag.
Hi, thank you. The calendar says it's July, and the summer is supposed to be for relaxation, but the Health Policy Commission just keeps rolling along. So I appreciate everyone who's here coming, and we have a very full agenda, so we should get at it as quickly. I want to thank my fellow commissioners for joining us, which is we got. So the first thing on the agenda is to approve the minutes for our March 29th meeting. Okay, is there a second? Any additions, corrections, changes? If not, all in favor? Okay, very good. So we have coming up a bunch of important activities related to our cost trends and market performance. So I'm going to turn the program immediately over to my friend over here to the right, David Cutler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the intro. And it's good to see people. It doesn't feel like July. We have 3 items for the cost trend and market performance for the meeting today. As you see, they're on the screen. First, we want to do our now standard update of notices of material change. And then second, because it's most related to the first, I'd like us to jump to the third item, which is the continuation of the cost and market impact review for Partners Healthcare and Mass Eye and Ear. So that'll flow much more naturally once we do that. And then we'll come back and pick up the performance improvement plan discussion. So a lot of market performance performance study this morning. So let me, David, shall I turn it over directly to you, or shall I?
Good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to thank you, commissioners. It's great to see you again. It's been a while since we were all here together. As outlined by the chair and Professor Cutler, a number of business items to walk through today, but also a number of items where we're hoping to get your input and feedback as we continue to think about the strategic priorities of the Health Policy Commission, our goals for the upcoming cost trends hearings. And so really looking forward to your input and discussion today. First, though, we do have a number of items on the market performance side, so I'm going to turn it over to Megan Wolf, who is our Deputy Director for Market Performance. Sitting next to her is Kate Mills, our Director for Market Performance, to run through the next couple of slides.
Thank you, David and David. As described on this slide, the HPC has received notice of 82 provider transactions with clinical affiliations and physician affiliations tied for most frequent. Since our last board meeting, we have received 3 notices of material change that are still under review. These include the proposed acquisition of the non-hospital-based laboratory business of Cape Cod Healthcare by Quest Diagnostics, the proposed acquisition of the non-clinical assets of Reliant Medical Group by Optum Care, a subsidiary of United Health Group, and the proposed merger of Care Group, Leahy, South Coast Regional Health Systems, the parent of Anna Jake's Hospital, as well as the related acquisition of the Beth Israel Deaconess Care Organization by the merged entity and the contracting affiliation between the merged entity and the Mount Auburn Cambridge Independent Practice Association. The HPC has also elected not to proceed to a cost and market impact review for 2 transactions. First, the proposed joint venture between UMass Memorial Health Ventures and Team Behavioral Health to build a new inpatient psychiatric hospital in Worcester. Our analysis suggested limited scope for changes in healthcare spending based on an examination of prices for psychiatric services in central Massachusetts and the fact that UMass Memorial does not intend to charge a facility fee for any outpatient psychiatric services it may provide at the new facility. Second, the proposed clinical affiliation between Atrius and Lowell General Hospital, under which Lowell General would become a preferred provider for Atrius patients. Our analysis suggested limited scope for changes in spending given the parties' long-standing relationship.
For one transaction on the next slide, we have recommended proceeding with cost and market impact review. Partners Healthcare's proposed acquisition of Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary and its affiliated physicians. Following Dr. Cutler's lead, jump ahead and that.
Before we jump ahead, I just want to pause to see if there's any questions or comments on the notices received to date and the ones that we elected not to proceed with the cost and market impact.
So if an entity, as you said, UMass Memorial, said they didn't intend to charge a facility fee, is that a binding sort of thing, not to charge a facility fee? Or is it just goodwill?
So they've made this commitment publicly. As with many transactions, we are going back and seeing how different market participants have held to the claims that they have made to us. And so at the very least, we would expect to highlight if folks who have made assertions to us do not abide with those over time.
Just on that very specific point, that was an issue we have teed up a bit for discussion at our annual cost trends hearings this fall.
Correct.
And the issue of whether the promises, how the performance on material change notices compares to what was told to us with the performance.
Exactly.
But it's fair to say, Dr. Allen, that it is not a legally binding.
Just a
question on the Reliant Optum. I read the notice and I sort of struck with a lack of specificity around non-clinical assets. I assume we're digging deeper into what that actually means.
That's correct, and that's obviously currently under review, so we expect to have more at an upcoming meeting.
The receipts in 329, are all of those complete applications or submissions that are starting the clock, or are they at different timelines for each?
As of now, none of the three is complete.
So once we receive a complete notice with associated information, at that point we begin the 30-day clock, so to speak, in terms of our review and decision about whether to proceed or not to a CMIR.
Other comments or questions? Obviously, we will hear more about them as they move along.
Yes.
Okay, shall we turn then to the
So I'm going to have Megan dive into the details of the proposed transaction. But before we do that, I wanted to provide the Commission with a quick reminder of our process for reviewing material change notices and determining whether to initiate a cost and market impact review, as it has been a while since we've done that. So as you all know, when providers propose material changes to their operations and governance structure, they're required to provide notice to us, which involves both a public filing, which we post on our website, as well as confidential filing of the underlying agreements and other information as we may require. From the completion of all of that required material, as highlighted, the HPC has 30 days to conduct our initial analysis to determine whether a transaction raises the potential for the parties to have impacts to cost and market functioning that warrant a more extensive examination and public consideration. To inform that analysis, the HPC looks at a range of factors relating to cost and market functioning as laid out in our statute, such as the potential for changes to price, total medical expenses, and market share. Where the HPC determines that a proposed transaction raises the potential for those impacts, staff makes a recommendation to conduct a cost and market impact review and provides notice to the parties. And then at the next regular meeting of the Commission, which is the meeting that we're at today, the Commissioners must then vote to continue that review. And just for context, as highlighted here, of the 78 transactions for which we've completed our reviews to date, 7 have been full cost and market impact reviews. So that gives you a sense of how often we recommend this. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan to describe why we recommend further review here for Partners' proposed acquisition of Mass Pioneer.
Thank you, Kate. As everyone is aware, Partners is the largest healthcare system in the state by a margin, both for hospitals and physicians. It has 8 general acute care hospitals and 1 psychiatric hospital in Massachusetts, as well as a payer, neighborhood health plan, and home health and rehabilitation providers. It also contracts on behalf of more than 6,700 physicians. Partners' hospital and physician prices are also among the highest in the state. Due in part to their high prices, Partners' hospitals are excluded from a number of limited network and Mass Health managed care products and are often in the more expensive tiers of tiered network products. Mass Pioneer includes a specialty hospital, the Mass Pioneer Infirmary, and a physician organization that employs more than 200 specialists. The Mass Pioneer Infirmary focuses on outpatient eye, ear, nose, and throat services. Mass Pioneer functions as the ophthalmology and otolaryngology departments of Mass General Hospital and provides ophthalmology services for Brigham and Women's. The hospital, Mass Pioneer Infirmary, currently contracts independently. Its physicians contract through Partners for the 3 largest commercial payers and independently for the other commercial payers. Mass Pioneer is generally considered to be an efficient provider and is significantly lower priced than Partners for the contracts it negotiates separately. It is often included in limited network products and Mass Health managed care plans, as well as frequently in the most efficient tier of tiered network products. The parties' goals for the transaction include for Mass Ioneer to provide ophthalmology and otolaryngology services across the entire partners system, to allow Mass Ioneer to use existing partners' facilities rather than expend capital to build its own, and to generally achieve operating cost savings and reduce duplicative costs. The parties state that Mass Ioneer plans to continue its existing clinical relationships with other providers, and the parties also state that they expect to achieve market competitive rates for Mass Ioneer and its physicians.
What does that mean?
That will be part of our review.
I mean, it sounds like a neutral term. Okay.
Our preliminary review raises concerns about potential impacts on costs and market function in Massachusetts, including increases in hospital spending as Mass Ioneer Infirmary begins to contract through partners and its hospital prices rise to the levels of other partners' hospitals. Increases in physician spending as Mass Ioneer physicians begin contracting through partners with all commercial payers, and impacts on Mass Ioneer's status as an efficient provider of eye, ear, nose, and throat services, including its availability and high-value status in tiered and limited network products and Mass Health managed care plans. As we do in all reviews, we will examine whether corporate affiliation is necessary to the parties' objectives in light of the parties' current clinical and contracting relationships. And we will also examine the parties' claim that the transaction will result in operational efficiencies that could improve the cost and quality of care.
This next slide details the factors based on those laid out in our statute that we plan to analyze as part of this review. These include factors relating to cost and market functioning that we've already highlighted, such as changes in prices, changes in total medical expenses, and changes to referral patterns, changes that would impact the quality of care, and changes that would impact access to care. To analyze these factors, we are requesting certain data and documents from the parties themselves, from other market participants such as payers, and as always, we welcome feedback and data from other market participants such as other providers, as well as patients. We plan to use these confidential data alongside other data sources, such as the data collected by the Registration Provider Organizations Program, the All Payer Claims Database, and SHIA's relative price and total medical expense data. As always, we are working with our team of experts, many of which are nationally recognized both internally and externally, including teams of care delivery experts, actuaries, economists, and accountants to conduct our analyses. At the end of this process, as you know, will be a public report with factual findings. The parties will have an opportunity to respond to that preliminary report, and then subsequently, the HPC would issue a final report. As a reminder, we do not have the authority to block a transaction, but we may refer our reports to other state agencies. I'll also note that this transaction is under review by the state's Department of Public Health under the new determination of need regulations, and we would expect that our public report would be available to them as they conduct their own review, which is on a slightly longer timeline than our own. And speaking of that timeline, as a reminder, our statute provides that we have 185 days to complete our process from the date notice was complete to us, which in this case was at the beginning of June. So assuming that the parties are able to timely respond to our information requests, that means that a final report would be issued by December. However, it's our hope that we can potentially publish before that deadline. And I will pause there before moving us along to a vote to consider any questions.
So I have a technical question that you don't have to answer, but I would hope that in the review it would get discussed. So Mass Ioneer now is often in many of the tiered or preferred network plans of the various payers, correct?
That's correct.
Where Partners is not. So we don't know what will happen after the merger, but obviously we need to play out different scenarios. One of the scenarios, obviously, is that Partners decides that it's going to price Mass Ioneer closer to what it prices either at the academic medical centers or even at some of its suburban hospitals or outpatient care. At which point, it's possible that some of the payers may choose to drop Mass Ioneer from its preferred network. So my question, well, that's a potential scenario that I'm sure you're going to be looking at. My question is, when you do that, will you look at how Partners operates when it is not in a network and a patient who has a network plan goes to them? What do they charge? One of the issues that is swirling around, and of course there was a major report yesterday in the New York Times about what's going on in this country. And of course we have been looking into it. So my question, and as I said, I don't expect an answer now, but I would hope we would look at it, is what does Partners do when it receives a patient that is a network patient but is using do they charge their normal fees? Do they charge in excess of their normal fees? And that we would build whatever that is into our cost estimates is one of the potentials. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Stuart, and that will be one of the areas we look into. And we know today there are some networks that include the hospital, but do not include the associated physicians, the physicians that are currently contracting through Partners. And so we can even look at some examples today where there is a potential discontinuity for patients seeking care that may be surprisingly given an out-of-network bill from physician services, even though they thought they were doing the right thing and going to an in-network hospital.
One of the concerns that I have is more global in nature, but related to what the chairman just stated. When we look back and we take into consideration the acquisitions and mergers that have taken place, plus what's on the table today, what's the overall global impact in terms of care in Massachusetts? And that is a concern we need to look at.
Absolutely, and I think we're going to have a little conversation later about the cost trends hearings. One of the things that we have tracked over the time is the consolidation of care into the top major systems. And as there are significant consolidations that are being proposed that will be under our review, what is the sum total of changes that have occurred over the last 5 years? It has been a very, since the HPC was established, it has been a very dynamic period of concentration and consolidation. So I think it is, yes, incumbent on us to not just look at each individual transaction, but what are the sum impacts of these as well.
So I think it's important to look at specific populations and the impact on those as well. So I'm thinking, of course, this pediatric population. Bread and butter, ENT kinds of problems and eye problems are handled often in the community, but then the more complex ones get handled at places like the Eye and Ear or Children's Hospital. So I guess my question is, first of all, what would be anticipated in terms of the fallout to the pediatric population with or without a merger and access to care to very complex care.
I think that's absolutely right, and we'll be looking to understand a better profile of the types of services that Mass Eye and Ear is providing. They do provide many of those community-based services as well as the specialized services. And so both in terms of different demographic populations, but also in terms of different payer populations. One of the things that we looked at in our preliminary review was their inclusion in certain Medicaid managed care plans. And there are some plans within the MMCOs that do not include the full partners network, but currently today do include the Mass IUD.
So, should we go ahead with this? Let me make sure I understand the timeline. That we would issue our preliminary report by when?
It would need to be by this fall, so we have technically the 185 day deadline that gives us until December to have a final report. And so, given that we need to give them 30 days to respond, we would need to issue our report certainly no later than the very beginning of November. However, it would be our hope to issue prior to that.
So we would ideally in September or October have our preliminary report.
Correct.
Us to consider and the parties to respond to.
That is certainly our goal. We have had already some very productive and constructive conversations with the parties in terms of our additional information requests. They are working on those to the extent that they're able to work and get that information quickly. We hope to expedite our process here in terms of our preliminary review. So working very closely with the parties on this so far has been very positive.
Mr. Chairman, I think I turn it over to you then for the motion.
Yeah, that's right. All right, well, okay, so an important area, and so we need a motion to authorize the continuation of the cost and market impact review.
So moved.
Okay? All in
Second.
All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? You have your marching orders, and we look forward to the report. Thank you so much.
Okay, very good, thank you. And then let us now turn back then to the performance improvement plan discussion. And
So moving back to slide 13 for those of you following.
let me turn it over then to Kate.
Actually, I'm going to have Kara Vidal do all of the talking on performance improvement plans.
Kara, thank you so much.
So Commissioners, you received the confidential 2017 list of named entities by email in June. So what I wanted to do today was three things. First, just give you a little bit of background that the CTMP committee got in May about how the list was generated this year, ways it was different from the list we looked at last year. Give you some very high level summary of what we see in the list, and then tell you the next steps for review. So this first slide is a recap of what we did last year. Last year, the list was generated by CHIA using a methodology in which they referred any payer or provider whose health status adjusted total medical expense in at least one book of business.
Can I just stop you for 1 minute? And give us just a 1 or 2 minute summary. This is a very important ongoing activity of the commission, which is now reaching a new stage. And it's probably worth a minute or two to go back and explain to us all and to the audience what we're talking about. Because I really think what you're doing and what we're doing is going to be very important. David?
Great. Yeah, so just do a little level setting. And this is a really important process for the Health Policy Commission and candidly a complicated one. So in Chapter 224, the law lays out a process for the Health Policy Commission to review entities that have been identified by the Center for Health Information and Analysis as excessively contributing to healthcare spending growth in the Commonwealth. And the Health Policy can make a decision whether to identify one of those entities and require a performance improvement plan. And a performance improvement plan will include steps taken by that entity, that organization, and this notably can be both a provider and a health plan, to address their own spending cost drivers. That performance improvement plan is developed by that entity, but it is submitted to the commission for approval. The commission will have to make a judgment call to say, does the plan that they've laid out do we think it will actually succeed, and do we think that it will actually address the cost drivers that we have identified in that individual organization. This is an important part of Chapter 224 because it is truly the accountability measure for the benchmark. And the legislature had a delayed effective date for the Commission's authority in this area. For the first couple of years, the HPC did not have this authority. Really, last year was the first year that we worked through this process. And so this year is our second year of receiving this list of identified entities from CHIA, doing an internal review, and potentially requiring an organization to have to file and conduct a performance improvement plan. So this is a process that, as we laid out, I think actually at our last board meeting, we expect to work very closely with commissioners on. I would highlight again, I think you know, the identities of the organizations on that list is confidential and something that we protect closely until such time as the commission does vote to require a performance improvement plan, at which time that organization is publicly named and posted on our website. We discussed at our last meeting the potential for this commission to actually go into an executive session at that stage to allow for discussion of so named organizations. We're not at that stage in the process yet, as Kara is going to lay out, but as you'll hear, we conduct a very thorough review of these organizations to truly understand what is going on with them and are they, is it prudent for us to recommend a performance improvement plan. I think this commission has taken the position that just because your name is on this list does not mean that you automatically get a performance improvement plan. And we need to really roll up our sleeves and understand what the drivers are here. So that's just a little bit of background about this process.
Great. Thank you. So last year, in determining which entities wound up on the list, she used a single referral methodology, which was at least one book of business with health status adjusted total medical expense, HSA TME, growth that was greater than 3.6%, either from 2012 to 2013, which was based on final data at the time, or from 2013 to 2014, which was based on preliminary data at the time. So that methodology yielded a list of 25 providers and 8 payers. We conducted the gated review process that David described, and from then we found that there were 3 providers and 1 payer we felt warranted follow-up. We followed up with those entities, but ultimately the board did not vote to require a performance improvement plan last year. So that methodology has been updated slightly by CHIA. They released that methodology for public comment last fall, received comments, and were good enough to come to the CTMP committee in May to describe those updates in a more fulsome manner. I will give you a brief overview now. So on the next slide, previously there was only one pathway to referral, which was HSA TME growth above 3.6%. CHIA has since added a second referral pathway for both providers and payers. This slide is the provider referral pathway, and it's below. So this pathway starts with HSA TME growth of 85% of the benchmark rather than 100%, which is 3.06% this year. If that's the case, then CHIA said it's also important that this entity have significant size. So they looked at entities with a share of statewide member months greater than or equal to 2%, which sounds quite small, but in fact actually does an effective job of weeding out the smaller providers. And then there's an option. If there is either the entity's level of HSA TME is at or above the 75th percentile for that payer network, or their unadjusted total medical expense growth was greater than or equal to 3.6%. So either of those 2 options would lead to referral. On the next slide, you can see the...
Can I just interrupt? You said payer network. Is it payer network or provider network?
It is payer network in this case, so we would be looking at, for example, provider A's commercial business for this payer.
Okay.
And then it would be 75% for that payer. So understanding that some payers just have a higher baseline than
So you would do it for each provider for the multiple payers.
That's right, so providers are referred for each book of business
Right.
that hits one of these thresholds. So we would look, if we were looking at, payer A commercial, we would look at all of the providers who had a commercial contract with payer A and determine whether this specific provider's level of HSA-TME was in the 75th percentile or higher.
If you flipped it on its head and said, for a provider who had 4 books of business, would the threshold be if they were at 75% or more for 1 book of business or all books of business, or how did you subdivide that?
So what GIA does is they look by book of business. So they would apply either one of these methodologies to each individual book of business. And so some entities, the way we talk about the list, we talk about ultimately the number of entities on it, but in reality it is provider 1, book of business 1, book of business 2, provider 2, and they could be referred for multiple books of business or just 1 book of business.
So let me just give an example here. We have Celts Medical Associates. They had a health status adjusted total medical expenditure trend for their Blue Cross Blue Shield book of business, commercial book of business of 3.1%. Additionally, Celts Medical Associates has 3% of member months. And when Shield looked at Celts Medical Associates' level of how much they're spending, not trend, but the actual level, they found that Celts Medical Associates is one of the most expensive providers in Blue Cross Blue Shield's commercial book of business. And so Celts Medical Associates was in the 80th percentile. So while their trend Celts Medical Associates' trend wasn't higher than 3.6%, they were big, and their ultimate level was very high compared to other providers for that book of business.
And even if Celts Medical Associates were to perform very, very well in each of their other books of business, this 1 book of business would still be referred to us, we would still look at it, but we would take into context their performance in other non-referred books of business.
This is not a very tight sit at this point. It's letting a lot of things through, and then the step that we then need to do is to aggregate that and make a determination for the provider as a whole, or with respect to specific contract.
Thank you.
But this is quite important because we get criticized, and the program gets criticized, that says just by keeping 3.5 and you got the big guys on the top and they keep bigger, you just ignore them, and this type of a filter doesn't ignore them. And I think it's important that I'm really glad you went back through that. And I think all of us need to understand that bigness does matter, and it's not like we just let them through without even looking at them again. I mean, we may not choose, because they're big, to review them, but it's one of the filters. Thank you.
It both adds in a nuance of size and also level, whereas before it was just trend. And whether you could be a very low-priced provider and have a big trend and end up on the list, but in other cases you may be very high-priced, your trend wasn't as big, but the impact on total healthcare spending is obviously bigger for the higher-priced, bigger entities. So that's what this is trying to kind of get at. And just for clarification's sake, when we're talking about book of business, we mean like Blue Cross Blue Shield commercial, Huff's commercial, also includes Medicare Advantage, so that can be a book of business that you're identified for, and the Medicaid Managed Care Organization's book of business. So all these are different books of business that a provider may be identified for and end up on a list to us.
The next slide is the new methodology for payers. It is very similar to the provider methodology, except for the removal of this 75th percentile of the payer network, because of course the payer is the entire network. The other significant change is on the next slide. which is that CHIA is no longer referring entities on the basis of their preliminary data. That is to say, the list that we received this year looks only at 2013 to 2014 final trend. We have the 2014 to 2015 preliminary data. We will use it to add some context and color, but it was not the basis of referral. And the result that you can see here is that we have 14 named providers and 6 named payers, which is about half the size of the list last year, which makes sense given that we are looking at half the time. All right, so just to characterize a little bit for you at a high level the list, I look forward to giving you much more detailed information in a confidential setting. But the first slide here describes the number of books of business for which each entity was referred. So each block on this slide represents either a provider or a payer. You can see that those entities are clustered on the small end of the scale. So most were referred for 1 book of business, a few for 2 or 3, one out there at the 5 book of business mark. This is, we think, a great finding. It means that most entities where they have higher HSA TME growth, it was in 1 book of business, not all of their books of business. This is also an improvement from last year's trend where we saw a higher number of entities with 4, 5, 6, 7 books of business, although some of that is due to the fact that we were looking at 2 years of trend. On the next slide, we have now shifted what the blocks mean. On this slide, blocks refer to a book of business, so an entity could be referred for multiple books of business, which is why there are more than the 20 blocks on this slide. And here you can see that there's clustering in the commercial side. We did say last year that given what we know about rate variation and the impact that negotiation has on commercial contracts, that we were going to give special consideration to books of business that were commercial. I think that will continue to be the case this year. So the next steps in the process are to share with commissioners the results of the gated review process. We hope to do that very shortly, get your feedback and recommendations there. After that, there will be follow-up with the entities for which follow-up is recommended. We will share those results with you as well. And then the last step in this initial process would be the vote to require a performance improvement plan. And the next slide gives you a general sense of timeline. We are targeting the November board meeting for that final vote, which gives us, it feels like a lot of time. It is warm and it's summer here, but it really only gives us 3 months to share those results with you, follow up with entities, and get our ducks in a row for a final.
Carol, let me just stop you again. And go back to that slide where you separate commercial, Medicare, and mass health. Both Medicare and mass health have really pretty tight limits on at least the prices that they pay, and usually significantly under the benchmark. So when one of these units exceeds the benchmark, it's probably for something else. Now, it could be utilization, which is more likely. In the case, it may be, like in the case of Medicare, one of the adjusters, like the teaching adjustment, or something like that would change substantially, or something like that. But for the most part, is it fair to say that when you're dealing with those two, you're dealing with utilization issues that generate a spending rate that exceeds the benchmark? Is that fair to say? Where in commercial, you're dealing with the complexity of both.
I think we would agree that price is less of a factor for the Medicare and Medicaid.
And when you're dealing with utilization, you're dealing with a much more complex issue because, for example, you could have a shifting of patients from provider A to provider B. The total may not change at all, but provider B all of a sudden looks like it's spending a lot more money. So all I would say is that, and I'm sure I'm telling you nothing new, but it's a different sort of analysis between the three.
I agree. This year is also going to be particularly complex in the mass health Commonwealth care space because we know that the 2013 to 2014 Commonwealth care data were unusual given transitions in population. So that's another factor we'll take into account.
And I think last year, when you got to the point of sitting down with each of the identified either providers or payers, some of these issues that Stuart is raising now came to the fore. At least that's what you discussed with the commissioners, that it was much less unit price or charges than it was, complex chronically ill patients over which, they really didn't have control, as opposed to, gee, what, you could become more efficient, if I'm remembering that correctly. So what's nice to know is that we have that process in place that we've practiced to be able to sit down and really understand the key drivers.
Yes, it's very nice to give these entities, the handful or so that we will follow up with, the opportunity to bring in some of their own data, shed some light on some of these utilization trends, which is exactly what happened last year. Some of those answers were very clear, and there was obvious next steps, and the providers or payers were taking them, and in some cases it's not quite as clear, but yes, that was a helpful process.
Just two quick things. One, do we know what the number of referrals would have been in 2016 if we applied the 17 process to it?
Last year, what the list would have looked like if we had not.
Yeah.
We have done that analysis if we only used the final data, which has a much bigger impact than the addition of the second prong. I can tell you that the addition of the new referral pathways in this year's list generated 2 new provider books of business, not new provider entities. Both entities would have already been referred for other books of business. 2 total books of business were referred under the second prong on the provider side and 0 on the payer side. So in fact, this new referral methodology did not broaden the list as much as we would have thought. We haven't done the reverse and looking at what last year's list would have looked like, but probably the impact would not have been as great as the impact of chopping off the preliminary data.
And then how many of the same entities are on both lists? Referred last time and this time?
I do have that. Because last year's list was based on not only 12 to 13, but also 13 to 14, most of the entities who were referred for at least one 13 to 14 book last year were also on this list, although I want to say it's about 5 in each category. 5 entities who were referred for their preliminary data last year and fell off the list, and a handful, maybe 3 or 4 who were not referred for their preliminary data last year, but final data does lead them to be referred. So a little bit of change in both directions.
So ready to not vote on this. We discussed it at the committee and went through many of the details and but we don't vote on it here. So this was more in the nature of an update.
David, could you just walk through, I think it's slide 19, or Karen and David together, in terms of rough time frame here? I know that you're aiming for the fall, but are we going, is the intent to have an executive session to kind of, if you could just put a little more meat around slide 19, those specific issues, that would be helpful.
Sure. So we are hoping to sit down with commissioners as early as today, if anyone wants to stick around after the meeting. We have conducted the preliminary review, and our hope is to share that preliminary review with all of the commissioners. And really what this was is just to identify those that we want to have some more information from. So we're not yet at the stage of making a recommendation, but we want to have a lot of consensus around that from commissioners. The second stage where there is an option to go into executive session is, as we've built our process, we have at one point said we are required to send notification, confidential notification to all of these entities. And what we did last year is, in sending that notification, for most of the entities we said, you were identified on Chia's list, However, the HPC has decided not to proceed with a performance improvement plan this year. However, we'll be in touch if you keep showing up on the list. And so we were able to give most of the identified entities both their notice and basically a free pass for this year. And only a handful of entities got a notice that said you were on.
The first group where we chose not to move forward were very small contracts in terms of numbers of people, where there was a clear outlier that looked like it might have been a couple of very expensive cases, or something like that, so that it was understandable what was going on. And the rest of the book of business did not look particularly unusual in any way. And so we decided not to proceed with those particular cases, and then we discussed the ones where there was a pattern that looked more concerning.
Great.
Okay, so Chairman, I believe that concludes the cost trends and market performance.
Very good, thank you, David. Okay, we are going to now. Okay, so we're going to now move on to our strategic. Is that next on the agenda?
Yes, it is. I'm happy to take over quarterbacking this particular part of the conversation. So the next, I'd say 20 to 25 minutes, even a half an hour, want to tee up a conversation with this commission around what are our strategic priorities and the framework by which we do our work at the Health Policy Commission. And this has been an ongoing conversation that we've had at a number of the commission meetings really throughout this year. So for those of you who are following along, we've skipped ahead to slide 32. And what I'm going to walk through for you in just the next couple of minutes is a draft framework, and I emphasize the word draft here, that we have put together to just try to create a framework for the work of the agency and to help us think about areas to really prioritize our work and our impact moving forward. I'm presenting this to you really in the interest of getting feedback from you today. This is not a final version, as I said. So, and leading out of this conversation, we'll want to talk to you about particular areas that you are all interested in terms of the cost trends hearings coming up. So on slide 32, what you see here is just pulling back to the ultimate big picture of why the Health Policy Commission exists. And so we start, as always, with our statute. An act in improving the quality of healthcare and reducing costs through increased transparency, efficiency, and innovation. And I think our ultimate goal, as laid out in the statute for the Health Policy Commission, is really focused on reducing healthcare spending growth. And the ability for the Commonwealth to meet the state's benchmark, which we set and is tied to the overall economic growth. However, to achieve that benchmark, I think we also have a broader vision for a healthcare system that can meet the needs of its patients, that can provide better care at a high quality and at a lower cost. So the goal is always around reducing spending, but the way that we get there does include a vision for an improved healthcare system and an improved healthcare market. So both of those things working together. So what you see on this next slide, slide 33, is really trying to take what's written into the statute and kind of bucket our work into two big areas, two big policy priorities that we're trying to move forward on. One, which we just spent a lot of time talking about, is strengthening our market functioning and the transparency of our system. How can we make our healthcare market work better? And we spent a lot of time at the agency thinking about how payers and providers compete, how they're rewarded for the services that they provide, and that we have a healthcare system that is transparent and that we can track changes year over year. The second policy priority laid out in the statute is really focused on the delivery system. and how can we promote a delivery system that provides efficient, high-quality care that has the right payment structures, incentives to be able to do that. And here we think about some of our activities around the CHART investment program, around our ACO certification program. So another key and core part of what we do as an organization. We think that these two things self-reinforce, that having a well-functioning market will help incentivize an efficient healthcare delivery system, and that both will result working together to reduce healthcare spending growth. But the balance of the work of the agency is really in these two areas. So I'll move forward and then I'll stop for some reaction. The next slide is one you've seen before, which talks about how do we promote these two activities? How do we promote these policy priorities? And you can see here the different roles that the HPC plays. The research and reporting arm, which is so important for investigating cost trends, our convening capability for bringing people together to understand solutions, our watchdog role in understanding and intervening where necessary in the healthcare market, and finally as a partner and an investor and a grantor of resources to the healthcare industry. So the next slide puts all of this together, which is to say, what are the strategies that we use as an organization? We're a convener, a partner, a researcher, a watchdog. What are the policy priority outcomes that we're trying to achieve? A stronger market and a more efficient healthcare delivery system that we think will ultimately lead to a system that produces better care at a lower cost, and ultimately our main goal, reducing healthcare spending growth to meet the benchmark. So this is just a framework for thinking about the many things that we do. And I wanted to bounce this off of you guys to get your reactions in terms of, does this align with your thinking of how the HPC does its work? Are there things that are missing here that you think are important that we should be building as part of our kind of core foundation of how we achieve this work? And ultimately, moving forward a little bit, if we have limited resources, where do we want to prioritize those resources among these different policy priority areas? So, Mr. Chairman, I'm gonna turn it over to you to kind of lay your perspective here.
Comments or suggestions to David? I really, this is great, but this is where I think we've been leading. So while you're thinking about it, I mean, I do really like the way you laid it out. You know my ongoing saga issue, which is that if you just want to reduce spending, at one level that's very easy to do, you just spend less. But if you spend less and don't really focus on areas that really could benefit from efficiency or waste and stuff like that, you could wind up spending less on services that are really valuable. So and on the other hand, if you just focus on efficiency and wasteful spending, but you don't do anything on the spending, given the capacity of the health system to spend money, it will find other places. It's like water dripping out of your attic. I mean, if you plug up one hole, it'll go someplace else. So it really is a true partnership. And as I said, I like the way you laid it out. You need both to do a good job in lowering spending, but to do it in ways that not only doesn't negatively impact on the health system, but actually, if you do it right, you actually can improve it. Because a lot of people really don't believe that. Oh, well, if you reduce spending, you have to lower quality or access. And of course, that's not true. So
Basically, continue the point that you just raised, Mr. Chairman. I would stress, I like slide 35, but in the goal, I would stress quality and access And I think that's important. I think that basically mirrors what the chairman had stated as well.
Just I think this is a very logical framework, and I applaud you. It flows very nicely. I noticed on slide 33, promoting an efficient, high-quality system with aligned incentives. Payers are not included in that. Is that deliberate, or is? And I think particularly not just commercial payers, but mass health and others.
That is not deliberate. By aligned incentives, we're really talking about payment reform. So probably should include payers. Thank you for.
So David, I'm in the grading business. So would you like to start the bidding as to what grade we deserve so far?
Who wanted to grade himself?
Yeah, I thought this was strategic planning. This is going forward, not backward.
No, but I'm just curious as to how we think you're doing. I mean, we've had successes in some areas, and we haven't been as successful as we had hoped in other areas, right?
I think I don't necessarily want to put our success here on the line. I think this is the HPC's work is truly a partnership with the healthcare industry to achieve these goals. I think it is fair to say for many organizations, we are not as far along in terms of payment reform and the shift from fee-for-service to alternative payment methodologies that we had hoped for when Chapter 224 was passed. And that is not knocking the very hard work of the providers and health plans to move forward on that. But the experience that I hear from providers is that they are still divided between the fee-for-service world and a truly value-based framework, and that continues to result in some significant challenges. So when I think around promoting an efficient, high-quality delivery system with aligned incentives, aligned payment incentives, I think that is an area that we continue to need to push forward on. In terms of market functioning and system transparency, I think we have brought tremendous transparency and had a tremendous impact in terms of highlighting both good and potentially negative market behavior over our time. So I'll go like an A plus, and maybe like an A minus on the other.
You could teach at Harvard.
Great inflation.
Well, I think, David Seltz was very gracious in being willing to go first. But I think, I think the healthcare innovation initiative is definitely an A, even though many of those projects are still in process. The process itself was fair, equitable, very broad. It really emphasized that investor function. So I would say it isn't just that we partner, but we invest. We grant funds so that all of the providers can start to test out and pilot and experiment with better ways to do things. So I think if we could make a list on the A to A plus side of things that I think over time we've done really, really well. And then certainly some of the things that we're responsible for, we have a little less control over. Certainly getting people to switch to alternative payment mechanisms is one of those.
So David, the one, please.
I was just going to say on the investments, I do feel like we've made had tremendous success in the grant programs that we've run. I think an area that I would propose that we prioritize moving forward, however, is making sure that we're taking the lessons learned from those grant programs and really disseminating them to a broader audience and scaling them as much as possible beyond just the grantees. And I think that is a strategy that will help not only spread the impact from those good work, but help us be able to really drive more of an impact on the delivery system itself. So thank you for those kind words. I think there's some work to be done in terms of spreading those words.
So, first of all, thank you, David. I think this issue about did we succeed or did we fail needs to be done in a very broad sense. And I'm not either trying to avoid blame, but I also don't want to take credit because I know if you take credit, then you're going to get blamed. Because, and the reality is that we are much more the watchdog and essentially the voice that tells the public whether we've succeeded or failure. We are not the ultimate source of either the success or the failure. So, and the way the law was set up, if we were a regulatory agency completely, then the responsibility would fall more directly on us. And I think the legislature correctly, with all its complexity of this law, which is still a source of complexity for me, legitimately put us sort of in the middle. So that's the first thing. The second and third thing that I want, and you know I've said this times, the one thing that you didn't mention is that Massachusetts is still part of the United States sometimes. Some of us would like to think about maybe leaving, but given that we are part of it, and there are a variety of forces that are out there that affect our providers and our payers, which are national in scope, I think we need to continue to recognize that we need to compare ourselves not only within ourselves, but how we're doing compared to the rest of the country, if not the rest of the world. Because these forces, whether it's drug prices or what's going on in Medicare spending and stuff like that, are really beyond our control. So we need to constantly prevail ourselves of comparisons, and we do that, but I think it needs to be built into this strategic discussion. The third issue, which is somewhat problematic, is that a lot of forces, particularly the press, but not unique to the press, likes to have a scorecard, which at times I think, not incorrectly, could be, you exceeded the benchmark, therefore you failed, as opposed to really, well, first of all, in statistics there are margins and statistical significance and stuff like that. So failure and success is not necessarily, if you're at 3.62 you failed, and if you're at 3.599 you succeeded. I think we owe and we need to be an educator when it comes to the public on just what's going on. And the second thing is, well, why did we exceed? And sometimes exceeding is a good thing, if in fact we are providing more health care to a population that is getting less health care. And so we shouldn't lose sight of, and I think Ron pointed out, that ultimately we are not trying to lower spending by reducing either access or quality. So we have a responsibility to educate the populace. And I think that the discussion over whether we exceeded or didn't exceed the benchmark sometimes has been a little less than I would think deserved. So I do think we need to emphasize our educational function to the world outside of the four corners. It's in there someplace, so it's not that it's not there. So again, I like where it is, and I do think we are going to have to be even more mindful of what's going on outside the state this year, given all the things that are potentially going on outside the state, and its implication for us. And I just don't want you to lose sight of it, and it needs to be in here. It is in here, I know it is, in the research area and stuff like that, but we need to highlight it.
That's a great point, and I just want to reflect back for the group. I'm hearing some consensus around the ultimate goal here, reducing total healthcare spending growth. That cannot come at the expense of quality or access, right? That just spending growth that roads are high quality or roads are high access is not the type of goal we want to achieve. Is that fair?
Yeah, please.
So I think we've been doing a terrific job, as has been pointed out, especially in the area of transparency. But now the question is, what should we emphasize going forward? And I think that if you ask any patient or many patients, or if you ask providers, do we have an efficient healthcare system? They would all say no. And it isn't efficient. And so maybe our next job is to figure out why isn't it and how can we help make it more efficient. When Mary Lou Sellers said at our last meeting from our minutes, institutions should think about how to re-engineer work and processes. And I'll get later on to my suggestion for something to talk about at cost trend hearings, more from the provider's perspective, but how do we make the system work better? And that's something that happens on the ground more and within institutions, and involves maybe technology, innovation, analyzing where the barriers are, what's complicated about the system, what is duplicative, and how can we fix that? Because if we don't do any of that, the payment isn't going to solve the problem. And having payment as an incentive or a way to control things is a good idea, but you still have to do something on the ground about the actual care. And so I hope that we will head in that direction.
Not to upset the professors on the commission, I don't believe in grading, but putting that aside, what I've seen in the short time I've been on the commission is that the whole group is very highly motivated, hardworking, and you really believe in what you're doing. And I commend you for that, and the state really needs that. And I guess Carol mentioned innovation, especially given what's going on in Washington today and how it can impact us. I would strongly recommend really thinking of how we as an organization can be innovative to impact quality on the positive side and at the same time help manage those annual increases in cost.
Thanks.
It's a great segue into your next section.
So the next section really is, as Dr. Allen just mentioned, where are the areas that we do want to emphasize moving forward? And are there some specific things that are embedded in these very two broad policy priority outcomes that we really want to lean in on and hopefully move the dial in a meaningful way? And so I'm going to skip right to slide 37, which is a focus area, and I would fully admit, even at this stage, these focus areas are still broad. And so even as we're looking at these, one of the things I'm looking for from the commissioners is, among this list of 6 things, one, are there things that we would want to think about adding, and 2, can we, among these 6 things, maybe focus on a couple, really focus on them. And so this focus area is kind of titled Right Care, Right Place, Right Time. And you can see here some of the key policy aims that promote that goal. Reducing avoidable hospital utilization, consistent with all of our cost trends research to date, avoidable ED visits, avoidable admissions, avoidable readmissions and ED boarding. Redirecting community appropriate care to high value settings of care, including through the potential greater adoption of telemedicine. Increasing APMs and the aligned incentives that support moving care to the right place. Promoting patient-centered medical homes and accountable care organizations that are designed to put the patient at the center and have a team that's focused on making sure that they're getting the care in the right place. reducing inappropriate utilization of high-cost institutional post-acute care. Again, another one of the key drivers that we've identified in past reports. And then finally, where we know that there is wide variation in providers, frequency of ordering certain tests and procedures that are, in many cases, medically inappropriate or not needed. Can we reduce inappropriate care that's being delivered in some of the variation settings? So this is a lot of ideas, and these are areas that we tend to have focused on in our past cost trends reports. Many of these have metrics attached to them that we include in our dashboard that we are tracking. And many of them, frankly, are areas where, since Chapter 224, we have not made a great deal of progress as a Commonwealth. And I'm thinking, in that case, specifically around readmissions, where we moved in the wrong direction in the most recent year that we were measured. So pausing on this list and hoping for any comments or reactions to these are areas of suggestion and focus.
Well, again, I just need to say that it's a two-sided coin. And while I'm sympathetic and agree with, and I said, you know, quality and reducing waste and stuff like that, in my own mind, I believe that if you just focus on the right side, you're going to save nothing. That we've been focusing on the right side and doing nothing for 40 years. So that you need both sides. And I'm not saying we're not doing this.
Oh, we have another focus area which gets
But
it.
it needs, you know, in other words, just if you have one, two, so we just have a third. And I just say it for my fellow commissioners, and that is when all gets said and done, if we don't figure out a way to translate the efficiencies into lower spending, which is what's happened in the past. And you know this, and you and I are on the same page. So I'm not telling you anything new, but I just need to remind myself and remind everybody else that it's both sides. It needs to focus on.
Thank you, David. Looking at this list, which I think is a good list, the thing that's a couple things stand out to me. One is reducing provider practice variation. I think is very important. That's one of the things within medicine that creates a lot of unnecessary expense, or actually just things being done to patients that maybe shouldn't be. So it might improve patient experience as well. So that, and it allows for you to, if you have some standardization of care, then you can figure out who's the outlier patient who needs something more or something special. But without any kind of standard, you can't even do that. So that to me is very important. The other thing is, in terms of redirecting community appropriate care, I think one thing that isn't on here is actually creating community care, or seeing what is in the community and what's missing and how can we provide it within the community so that patients can access it and have the kinds of supports, and whether it's care or whether it's prevention or even access to food or exercise or something of that nature, but it's something that's going to promote health and keep them out of institutions. I think that's another opportunity that we could use our research department to kind of look into and figure out how to make recommendations.
Seeing no other comments on this one, I'll just kind of move us ahead a little bit. The next slide, I won't pause on other than to say these are some of our key activities that feed in to this particular focus area. Obviously, our investment programs and our certification programs being the two big things here. As I mentioned before, an interest in developing and implementing a learning and dissemination strategy to take the learnings that we're getting out of these programs and make them available to other organizations. Included in here some potential areas of further research that we may want to look at, and consistent with some past work that we've done. And also wanted to highlight our work in supporting the executive office, who is also working hard on these issues through some collaborative state efforts around quality measurement alignment, HIT interoperability, and promoting ACOs and APMs.
All right, let me just add a little complexity to this list. And in not only right care, right place, right time, and I would add right provider. Whether it's using a primary care physician rather than a specialist, and potentially using an advanced nurse practitioner rather than a physician, using X, Y, and Z. In other words, when I look and compare the United States to other countries, I think often we blame either the patient too much. I mean, when you look at their delivery systems, they're not much more quote unquote efficient than we are. The big difference is they spend less, they have less workers, they pay their workers less. I mean, but it's not that, they use the hospital more than we do, they go to physicians more than we do. So just put that in as another character, and I know we've spent some time on that. Not everyone agrees, but then not everyone agrees with any of these things. So, it's just worthy of a discussion. We tend to have a very, and particularly here in Massachusetts, we teach in hospital and we have that stuff. So it just needs to be.
I think that's a great point, and certainly this commission has highlighted advanced nurse practitioners and dental therapists, which is kind of a mid-level dental position. Would note that the governor has filed legislation to expand scope of practice in a number of these areas, but certainly fits within this theme. So that's a good point.
After, maybe this may be better after you went to group focus too, but I'm sort of curious about what it would mean to really focus on this. Like, how would that affect what we do? How would it affect the day-to-day activities of the commission? So I want to really dig into that, but I think we should probably go through the other one first.
Sure, I can answer that question a little bit now, and I think keep it in mind as we think about the next one. One of the things that we've internally been thinking about is to say, all right, if everyone agrees that reducing readmissions is one of our focus areas moving forward, kind of creating a diagram and a work plan that basically says how do the different activities of the HPC feed into that goal, and really being able to lay out what we use in our grant programs. Is called a driver diagram. How do the different component pieces all fit together to say we want to reduce readmissions? And so I think we wanted to hear a little bit from commissioners about what are some of the areas that they think we should be focused on, and then have a specific game plan for each one of them, and be able to then track it over time and say, are we meeting the targets that we've set forth in some of these areas? So I do think that's really kind of the next part of this work, and I think that's what you're getting at. So the next.
Could I just add one comment, David Cutler? For me, looking at this and having had a little bit of a preview of it, it helps. It gets us to the point where our activities are a little more focused on the problems that we've elicited or that have emerged over the past, let's say, 3 years, particularly out of the cost trends hearings. So one of the things that the commission has wanted has been some direction, some focus, and to be proactive rather than just reacting to some of these. So I think, I think maybe we could fold providers under right care, but nonetheless, looking at these two areas and saying, what can we legitimately and effectively tackle over this next year to 2 years, to figure out the time frame in these two general areas, bring some focus to our own work that we've all been wanting. So for me, that's the benefit of this, and I think the staff's done an incredible job of keeping it broad enough so we have a menu to choose, but narrow enough so if we were to tackle these, or when we tackle them, we can hold ourselves to some important outcomes.
And I might just add that the HPC, David, Colleen, the whole team from the HHS perspective is incredible to work with. We all have to be cognizant all the time of running into one another. And I think, Wendy, you
have just said in terms of targeting and really strategically figuring out where HPC can have impact while still understanding where DPH and Mass Health and lots of other agencies are also acting is key, and I think the relationships are there and the communications there to keep Massachusetts at the forefront of innovation as we all want to support. But I do think that the implementation plan is critical. Picking the right priorities are important, and we certainly have plenty to choose from, but making the most impact and sort of considering where that is really critical.
Thank you, Allison. I completely agree. And there's many areas where the most appropriate place for us is a support role for another agency that really is their true mission, or it's using our data resources to help inform activities at the executive office or education. So thinking critically and carefully about how the state collectively uses its resources effectively, I think is really important. The next focus area, which I'm going to just flip to quickly, is on slide 40. So Stuart, this gets to, I think, your big areas of interest, enhancing the accountability and transparency of healthcare market changes and their impacts, promoting out-of-network billing transparency and protections, both on behalf of consumers, but also in the fact of strengthening our market and strengthening the viability of tiered and limited network products. Reducing unwarranted variation in provider prices has been something we've talked a lot about. Engaging employees and consumers with transparent information, potentially reducing inappropriate facility fee billing, and kind of a catch-all, where are those key drivers that are driving our healthcare spending growth, and can we make sure that we are transparently understanding them and have accountability for them? And I included in here an EG of pharmacy, where we do not yet have as much information as we would like. So the activities, obviously, that we do that kind of match up to this, we spent most of the morning talking about these, so I won't go through them again. But would highlight again those areas where we're doing some ongoing research. We are doing ongoing research on out-of-network billing, this concept of post-transaction reviews. So after a transaction has already happened, did they fulfill their promises that were laid out for us? Continued examinations of pharmaceutical price and utilization trends. And then a long list of things where we are working, again, collaboratively with our other state agencies to really move forward, and would highlight the first one there is really CHIA's responsibility to develop the transparent website. And we're working with others on some of these areas. So
I just want to go back to David's comment earlier on, and I would specific, and that is to monitor past promises or activities. What I'm looking for is that when a provider says, oh, if you let us do X and Y, we're going to be more efficient, and the question is whether they turn that efficiency into lower price, into lower spending, so they find other ways to spend it. So I think that's a role we need to continue to play, and I would stick it in as a number. That makes sense.
So, seeing no additional comments here, I know this was a lot of information, and as I said, very much a work in progress, and so appreciate the feedback here and the feedback offline as we continue to think about this, and hopefully we'll come back at the next board meeting and further this conversation, but really, thank you.
Peter, just one quick comment. I remember at the March meeting, Dr. Berwick asked the question about what this work plan might mean for the structure of the committees, or the commission. I don't know if you've given any thought to that yet, or intend to after.
I think the intention is there, and that this may feed into a potential restructuring of the committees around the new year. That is as far as the thinking has gone.
David, so this was extremely helpful. Can I pick up on a couple of things? One thing that occurs to me is, and it goes back to the earlier discussion where we were talking about success and failures. Some of these we have control over, and some of these we don't have direct control over. And so I think that's an important distinction. So for example, on things like helping to merge all the different quality metrics into one metric and having the state compile that book, those are things that we can directly have authority over, or not authority, we can directly push along because it may be a part of state government. Where there are other things like, did you see the correct provider at the correct time, where we don't necessarily have direct authority over. And so I think it's helpful for us to think about those a little bit separately. That is, some sort of very specific action items that we want to make sure that we do in our capacity, or that we work with fellow actors in state government or outside of state government, where we can really drive the process and come to a conclusion and say this is what either we're doing or we're recommending doing, or so on. And then there are other things for which it's really the actions of the providers or the insurers that are in play, and where we want, and where our role will necessarily be more of the kind of name and shame kind of review sorts of things, which we will then need to figure out how we address. And so that's the first sort of comment. I think the a somewhat related comment is, as we think about particularly the cost trends hearings as a launch towards moving forward with this, we should really think about them as a way to lay out some of these very specific goals. So for example, we've spoken, and Stuart just raised the issue again about, let's be very transparent about whether the promises have been kept, or the claims have been met in terms of what's going to happen. But similarly, to the extent that we choose to focus on specific areas, we should be very, very clear about where the state is in meeting those at the provider level, at the payer level, and where we think we ought to be able to get to. So if we took something like, say, the readmissions thing, we should say, look, the state should not be abnormal, and here's where we should be, and by the way, here is at each level of provider where they are on this, and you know, then we would think about what do we do from that point. How do we work with the providers? How do we work with the insurers? Whatever it is that we need to do, how do we change the payments and so on? How do we need to do that? So I think part of what it implies is both looking backwards and also looking forwards, and setting some targets and then laying them out there and saying, look, we're proposing these as targets. We want to, if you don't agree, tell us you don't agree, and tell us that it's a bad measure or it's too ambitious or whatever else it is. But if not, then tell us how we're going to go about meeting those, and what we have to do and what we have to do, and what other parts of the state or other parties have to do.
That brings us to the cost trend.
Yeah.
If I could just for 1 second, now that we've reopened the conversation back to the strategic imperatives, I won't be long, but I agree with a lot that's been said, including the big picture overview of how we want to approach the work and what the real mission, and really digging into that is the key focus. Makes a lot of sense in all of these policy and goals and research. I agree with much of it. I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of two important things we talked about in the past here at this board, which is one, the impact of the cost of the healthcare system in Massachusetts on low-income individuals, and the affordability question that's had a big hearing and conversation about yesterday in the Mass Health Medicaid program, but also really in the private insurance realm too. We gotta really keep that as a key focus. I think, I don't know, looking at it, I think it plays out in many different ways, but I just want to highlight that importance. And secondly, and again, we'll be a broken record on this every time I get the opportunity to, is the engagement of the healthcare workforce, and not just about protecting jobs, but about having a real conversation with the workforce in these institutions about why these changes are being made, the important need to reduce the overall cost of healthcare, and what role they play in it. We have many examples of that, particularly around reducing the rate of readmissions to emergency rooms. If we have conversations with the workforce about why these things are being done, why it's important to the institution, it's a different conversation when the workforce, the frontline healthcare workers, are engaged in that process. And I just don't want to lose sight of that in all of these conversations. The impact of the decisions and the cost of the healthcare system on our lowest paid workers and individuals in the state and the role of the frontline healthcare workers in identifying strategies to reduce costs in their institutions. I think we've seen when they're engaged, you can have a real impact, and I just don't think we should lose sight of those two important elements.
Thank you.
I would just offer one suggestion that while all of these goals are laudable, and I agree with, I think it might be worthwhile for us to pick maybe one or two from each focus area where HPC could be the driver of that goal. And that doesn't mean that the HPC can't still be a supporting agency within the other initiatives, but maybe one or two where other state agencies aren't taking the lead on it, and they can and really focus on that. Because I think that with 6 in each of these focus areas, it's a lot found to be the driving force behind it.
I think that's absolutely right, Lauren, and really the next phase in this work is both even continued focus. What are the strategies that we're going to apply to allow us to be successful? How do we use the data to measure whether we're being successful? So that's really our next phase of work here. So I'm going to move us forward. That was great, thank you. Save the date. HPC, Super Bowl of Healthcare is back, October 2nd and 3rd.
We're back with a new look.
We have a retro look on. It's our 5th hearing. So want to spend maybe just a couple of minutes, and I think you guys have given us a lot to think about just in this last conversations already in terms of some potential focus areas for the upcoming hearings. As you can see, I've moved us to slide 46. I won't read through the purpose of the hearings. I think you're well aware of them. We are suggesting some slight modifications to streamline the hearings a little bit to a day and a half, so provide, again, a little bit more focus, and potentially reducing the number of witnesses that we have on each panel to allow for a little bit of engagement. The bottom half of the slide is a bunch of different bullets on different ideas that have come up both through conversations with commissioners at the staff level, and at the bottom you'll see we did talk with our advisory council about this as well. And so you can see a number of different suggested items. Again, reducing institutional care, moving community appropriate care, that transactional review. Where are we on this continuum of payment reform? And then kind of a whole nother list, pharma, innovation, social determinants, serious illness care. We cannot do all of these things with the cost trends hearings. So interested in feedback from commissioners on what their top priority might be, or something that's not included on this list that we want to make sure that is on the list as we make these final decisions.
Thank you, David. So, this will be my last cost trend hearings as a commissioner. So I guess I would like to see something added, and that is more of a focus on administrative burden and the impact on the provider community. And also, I think, to Tim's point, workforce engagement, I think, could be part of that. So all of the things that are happening have impacts on patients, but they also have impacts on providers. And to the extent that providers are overworked, overwhelmed, discouraged, feeling like they're not making progress, that spills over onto the kind of care that they can provide and the impact on patients. And it feels like it's a problem that will have a solution at some point. And some of it is a technological solution, and some of it is may have to do with staffing models or things of that nature. But I think it would be interesting to hear from the provider community about the burdens that they are facing and how it's impacting care, and where they see opportunity to make improvements that would result in better and lower costs and more efficient care. Some of it is is that we're in evolution, like our electronic health records are just sort of stuck in a not very good place and aren't giving us the kind of benefits that we would hope that they could. And is there a way to go forward on that? Another is innovation and technology and tapping into telehealth, things like that. So if there's a way to, and then just regulation, the impact of regulation, I hear that complaint all the time from the physician community at least. So there's a way to address that. I believe there are people very well qualified to speak to that issue, including the Mass Medical Society has done some surveys of physicians at least, but other providers as well. I would like to see that addressed.
I would make a pitch for post-transaction review, particularly as it relates to reducing avoidable institutional care, as well as the shift from high-price provider to community provider. And I think in that area, both the good and the bad, what's worked, but what hasn't, and what can we learn from both of those. That's great.
I think this is a terrific opportunity for us to kind of kick off these two themes, assuming that we, between now and then, come to agreement about the scope of how broad and how narrow the themes are. So I really applaud the procedural changes that you've made. I think if we took kind of half the sessions on right care, right place, right time, and the other half on what we're able to evolve out of kind of the second piece. And then I really liked David Cutler's idea of having a panel where you took the data, and this would also be a place maybe where we could fold in the promises made, promises kept piece as part of the data set. We took a problem within each of those strategic areas. And I would like it on the record, I have not uttered the word readmission today, not once. If we took a problem, any problem, and kind of built the panel around where do we stand in that problem area? And then to Alice's point, what can we as a commission do working in partnership with other agencies? And maybe even then brought in outside experts who had solved that problem, so we don't just have a lot of whiny people on the panel saying we can't do anything. But we're really able to learn from other experiences. I think it would be a much more vibrant and exciting meeting that also gave us a jump forward or an impetus to keep working. So I think that there are ways to merge a number of different ideas that have come up independently or separately. Even kind of Stuart's idea of how do these savings kind of, if we were to have someone from Geisinger, how did you take those savings and translate them down into money in the patient's pocket or decrease in premiums, however you want to look at it. I think that could be a very exciting session.
That's great, thank you, Wendy. And I want to say, in the good news area for a lot of this, the sophistication of our research team and our market performance team continues to increase and allow us to have new data insights that we can use as a launching pad for some of these conversations, both in terms of the post-transactional review, but also in terms of mapping avoidable hospital utilization to provider groups in ways that has not been done before.
Okay,
Great.
all right, move on. All right, this was really good.
So just some timeline things. We'll be working on the hearings for the rest of the summer. We'll be back with an update in September, and would highlight for everyone in the audience, we do have that registration link, which is on your postcard if you pick one up. Encourage you to register. We have met full registration the last couple of years we've done the cost transferring, so register early and often. Or just one time, sorry. All right, great. So moving on to the next agenda item, we are here with the Administration and Finance Committee to approve our fiscal 18 operating budget. We met as a committee. The chair of the committee is Chair Altman. We met this morning and went through the budget proposal for over an hour with members of the Administration and Finance Committee. They did vote and approve the recommendation from staff up to this full board. So I will endeavor to move relatively quickly through these slides. However, of course, please pause and ask me any questions that may come up as we go through this. So the first slide, with the slide 50, highlights our inclusion in the recently signed state fiscal year 2018 budget. As you can see, we have our line item for the operation of the HPC, which is set by the legislature and signed by the governor. This amount is assessed to hospitals, acute care hospitals, ambulatory surgery centers, and health plans. Secondly, we received direction to conduct a study through an outside section of prescription dispensing practices. For those of you who may be familiar with this particular issue, it's sometimes called white bagging, brown bagging, and really asks us to look into this issue of the site's safety and cost of dispensing of drugs at different sites of care. So this will be a new work that we'll be conducting over the next 12 months. As you can see, we have a report due back to the legislature by next July. So more to come on this. We just saw the final budget with this included in it. So in terms of just an overview of our recommendations here, we have, as many commissioners know, 3 different funding sources that pertain to our operations. We have our line item that I just reviewed, which is set in the state budget. We also administer 2 trust funds, the Distressed Hospital Trust Fund and the Payment Reform Trust Fund. And these 3 sources together, and I'll show you a combined version of this, together fund the operations of the Health Policy Commission. What I'm not including here on this slide is the direct investments and grants that we make to individual organizations. This really is both payroll, contracted services, and the operating expenses of the HPC. So taking these quickly in turn, one from the line item, you can see a recommendation of what was included in the state budget. Important to note, this is level funding from what was included in last year's state budget, so it's the exact same amount that was included in last year's state budget, and we would plan to spend to that amount. Secondly, for the Distressed Hospital Trust Fund, these are expenses related to the administration of the CHART program. We are recommending a reduction in the budget for operating expenses out of the Distressed Hospital Trust Fund, really reflective of the fact that CHART Phase 2, which was the biggest and most intensive phase of the CHART program, is coming to an end during this fiscal year. There will be continued expenses with that Phase 2 as we receive final reports and close out that grant period, but do anticipate that we'll be having some reductions requisite with the slowdown of that spend. And then finally, out of the Payment Reform Trust Fund, we've dedicated the very small remaining balance of this trust fund for direct technical assistance related to our HCII, Innovation Investment Program, our PCMH, and ACO programs, and we're recommending a level funding for that trust fund, similar with what we approved last year. So those are the headline recommendations, and I can show you on the next slide how that all combines together and compares over years. So your slide, commissioners, is slightly outdated, but if you look into your left-hand pocket in your binders, you're going to see a graph that has 3 colors on it, as opposed to 2 colors on it. This was a last-minute change as recommended by the Administration and Finance Committee. And again, these are the combined sources of funding and spending for the different categories. As you can see, for the first few years of the agency, we were primarily funded out of the Payment Reform Trust Fund. That changed in FY17 when we moved on budget. And what I think is most notable here is that our combined spending as proposed for FY18 is a reduction from what we were approved last year, and would anticipate even a potential further reduction again in the year after as CHART expenses and the distress hospital expenses continue to wind down. So you can see in ARC, and really FY17, it does make sense. This was in the middle of our $60 million investment grant opportunity that we would be spending money requisite with that. I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit here. Slide 54 is around a number of appropriations that the HPC has received actually dating back 2 years ago, and our dispensation of those state appropriations. I will not walk through these in detail, other than to say I'm really proud of the partnership approach that we use to expend some of these dollars. I think very consistent with the comments from the Undersecretary and Lauren. There were places where the HPC received some money and we really said, this is better spent by the Department of Public Health. They should really be the ones to take lead on these activities. So in 2 of these big categories, we did enter into agreements with the Department of Public Health and fully transferred those dollars to them. Again, I think very much in the spirit of aligned activity across state agencies. Specifically on $100,000 for Narcan training, that got translated into 2,600 doses of naloxone that were distributed to community health centers in the Commonwealth, which is awesome. And also some funding to get our paramedicine regulations developed and hopefully continue that progress on that. Skipping a few more slides forward, I wanted to show you our staff levels from 2013 to 2017, and just to kind of walk us through this slide, I'll turn it over to the Deputy Executive Director.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So this slide, to orient you to it, dates back to the beginning of the HPC, January 2013. So over the past 4.5 years, we've had 102 staff come through our doors. Today we have 62 staffers here at the HPC. We have the most incredible staff. I will say that without reservation. So this is a total success story. We have been fully staffed actually for the past 1.5 years actually, and I expect to stay at this steady state continuing with our current responsibilities. So the range for full staffing is from about 60 to 65 staffers. And I think that's it. Any questions about the staff? State of the staff?
Strong.
Strong.
Just to give you another insight into how this budget breaks down. So this is mapping both payroll and contracted services to some of the different departments at the HPC and the work that we do. Just to quickly go around this pie, market performance includes our work on material change notices, cost and market impact reviews, performance improvement plans, and the registration of provider organizations all fall within this category. Strategic investments is our CHART investment program, as well as our healthcare innovation investment program and associated technical assistance and learning and dissemination. Our cost trends and research, pretty self-explanatory, our cost trends and research team. Accountable care includes both the 2 certification programs, ACO, PCMH, as well as other policy activities working on with our sister agencies at the Executive Office of Health and Human Services. Exec and operations is myself and Colleen, and the operational team, graphic design team, HR, fiscal, part of our operation, and legal and the Office of Patient Protection is that gold slice in the corner. So as you can see, we have some relative balance, I would say, between, if we think about in some very broad terms, market performance and cost trends and research being perhaps a little bit more on kind of the market functioning and transparency side, and the accountable care and strategic investments being a little bit more on the right care, right place time. Actually a pretty nice balance between those 2 philosophies. So in total, this is again adding a combined look at all of this for next year. Again, left to right, the line item, the Payment Reform Trust Fund, and the Distress Hospital Trust Fund with associated totals attached.
Any questions or comments? I too would like to reinforce Colleen's comments. I think from the point of view of those of us who are commissioners that watch the activities of the staff, I can't think of a more productive, more professional, and greater group of people who you guys have assembled, so thank you very much. And again, I want to emphasize what David said. If you look at the total spending, we are seeing a slight reduction in spending from this fiscal year, given the somewhat changing priorities. David is a great fiscal manager and has managed to keep a few little shekels in his pocket, so that even though there were some parts of the budget that invariably go up, like rent and certain increases and stuff like that, he's able to do that within this level budget, and we like it. Very good job, David. So if there's any questions, if not, I would recognize a motion to approve the budget.
So moved.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Abstentions? Keep at it, David.
All right, great, thank you. Staff can continue to be paid. All right, so we have one last agenda item to go through, and it's my executive director's report. Usually I speed through this at light speed, but there are some
Make sure we get the little touches.
there are some things that I do want to spend some time sharing with you in the executive director's report. So I know some of you may need to take off, but if you can stay a little bit longer, that would be great. So first of all, flipping to this slide 63, with all of these big blue boxes. We have not had a board meeting since March 29th. This is the longest time we have gone without a full board meeting in the history of the HPC, but we have been very, very busy. So during this time period, we put together just a little bit of the numbers of what's happened since the last time we were all here together. And we've had a number of joint committee meetings. We had a great, for many of you who came, a special event on consumer preferences and transparency and demand-side incentives. That was at the UMass Club. We've had a number of MCNs and market oversight. We have been certifying organizations left and right. 4 more PCMH prime practices and our 2 new accountable care organizations. We launched 18 new projects through our Healthcare Innovation Investment Program. We distributed millions of dollars through our CHART program and have had, as you can see, a tremendous amount of TA and trainings for all of our different programs. So even though this is 3.5 months since we've last been together, rest assured the staff have been extremely, extremely hard at work. 2 numbers that I want to focus in on just for the next couple of minutes. One is 13, our 13 summer fellows, and the next one is 4, our 4 new data points. So for the summer fellows, I'll turn it over to Colleen.
Thank you, David. So the first year of our official HPC Summer Fellowship Program was the summer of 2015. So each year we continue to grow and grow and grow our fellowship program, and next year it'll be a little bit bigger as well. We actually have 11 fellows this year from over 200 applicants from all over the country, all over the world actually. Extremely diverse educational background and experience that they bring to the HPC. They work for us full time for 10 weeks. And at the end of the summer, they write up little blurbs of what they did for us, their work at the HPC, and we publish a report. So if you want to see the reports from 2015 and 2016, they're on the HPC's website. We'll publish the 2017 report in September. But for right now, I want to embarrass all the fellows. Where are they? If you guys could all just stand up and wave and say hello. I won't read all your names out loud, but say hi. So we're halfway through. It's been a great summer so far, and we absolutely love having you here. So
Great. Thank you, fellows, as well. So the next topic, which I do want to spend a minute or two on, is data points. So data points is a new project that we launched since our last board meeting, where we've been issuing a series of more short online briefs that really do a deeper dive into some of the areas of cost drivers that we have identified in our cost trends reports. And for the first time, using technology, specifically software called Tableau, to be able to put data out into the public sphere that is interactive, that the public can go to our website and manipulate the data and look at the data and hopefully provide insights in new ways before. To date, we have issued 3 of these data points. The first one was a deeper dive into the issue of avoidable oral health emergency department visits, and found some interesting statistics, including a 15% increase in oral health ED visits during this time period for children and for seniors, and over 33,000 of these visits. Again, we see this as an inefficient use of our healthcare system, and frankly, poor patient care, because many of the patients who arrive in the emergency department are not treated for their oral health condition. They're provided pain medication and then connected to a dentist who can treat them. The second issue in the yellow here was looking at avoidable emergency department utilization. And again, we did a deeper dive into what is driving avoidable ED use, and actually looked at the types of clinical conditions that people were going to the emergency department for. And as you'll see in a minute, one of the neat things we were able to do is actually create a heat map of Massachusetts and allow people to go and click on their individual zip code and say, how many people in this zip code use the emergency department for an avoidable ED use, and what were the clinical conditions about why they showed up at the emergency department. And then the final area that we looked at in issue 3 was out-of-pocket spending for prescription drugs. And here we focused specifically on out-of-pocket spending for contraceptive services, and found dramatic and important decreases in the amount of out-of-pocket spending for women during the time period 2011 and 2014, consistent with the impact of the Affordable Care Act and the provisions there of no cost sharing for certain high-value preventative services. So these are 3, small little areas that we've looked into. Each one of these is probably about 3 graphs, a page and a half, and we found them to be very successful in terms of having, whether it's bite-sized or snackable or easy to kind of go onto the website, look and read, and we think provide some really important insight and information. So we are issuing our 4th one of these today, and so want to share with you some of the data that's in this 4th data point, which is an update to a report that we did last year on the opioid epidemic, and specifically opioid-related hospital utilization in the Commonwealth. So this was a big part of our study in our opioid report last year. We had data through 2014. We got the new year of data, so we have new year of data all the way through 2015. Our plan is to issue a very extensive chart book with all of the 2015 data sometime later this summer. But wanted to kind of preview some of the big findings for you today and show you, I think, a really interesting new map that we've created, which will provide some insight. So with that as kind of the introduction, I want to have Natasha, who is on our research and cost trends team, just talk through our 4 slides that we have on this particular topic.
So as David mentioned, for this data point, we looked specifically at hospital utilization for opioid-related discharges, both inpatient and ED. If you look at that yellow line, that shows the all opioid discharges, and we showed that there's a 56% increase in these discharges from 2011 to 2015, with the largest annual increase happening between 2014 and 2015, an increase of 18%. Below those 2 lines, we also show 2 categories that roll up into the all opioid category. The blue one is heroin-related discharges. From 2011 to 2015, heroin-related discharges increased 256%. But despite that increase, they still only comprised about 15% of the total opioid discharges. Looking at the orange line, that represents the lion's share of opioid-related discharges in the Commonwealth. These are for other opioids. These are discharges for other opioids, which is an abuse of prescription opioids. And from 2011 to 2015, this category of discharges increased 50%. One of the analyses we did is we looked at the rate of opioid-related hospital discharges by zip code in Massachusetts. So if I go to Vanna White over here, what we did is we looked at, as I said, opioid-related discharges by zip code, and then we divided the zip codes in Massachusetts into quintiles. This shows the world in 2011, and if we flip over to 2015, you can see quite clearly that almost all of the zip codes in Massachusetts saw an increase in the number of opioid-related discharges. One of the great things about Tableau that David mentioned is that it allows us to look at specific communities. So for example, if we were going to go to Lowell, Massachusetts, which is 01852. Lowell, Massachusetts is a community that we hear a lot about with regards to the opioid epidemic, both in the news and in other research. You can see here, if we go back to 2011, in 2011, if you hover over it, you can see that there were 236 opioid-related discharges in this community in 2011. That puts them in the second highest quintile in the Commonwealth. We also reported the hospital to which most of the patients in that zip code went for opioid-related care. If we go over to 2015, you can see that Lowell is now in the highest quintile in the Commonwealth. They have more than 1,000 discharges per 100,000 population. And this represents a 174% increase in opioid-related discharges. If we go to a different community, if we go to Foxborough, Massachusetts, another well-known community in Massachusetts, although they're known for a different reason. Of course, Foxborough is the home of the New England Patriots, who started training camp today. If we go to Foxborough, which is 02035, you can see that in 2011, this community was in the third highest quintile for opioid-related discharges. They had 90, I think that says 96, 96 opioid-related discharges, and that most of the patients in that community went to Norwood Hospital. Thank you. I can't quite see. But if we go to 2015, excuse me, this community is now in the highest quintile for opioid-related discharges. They now have more than 1,000 opioid-related discharges per 100,000 population, a growth of 79%. And I think what this shows you is that even communities that you don't necessarily think of when it comes to the opioid epidemic are really being affected by it.
Can I slow you down for 1 minute?
Yeah.
Apologize. And if you could remind me back to our report in 2014, where we talk about Massachusetts having the highest rate.
Yes.
What does that rate mean? What rate of what?
Massachusetts had the highest rate of opioid-related emergency department visits in
Rate
2014.
compared to, what's the rate?
Population per population.
So if we look at our total population of the state and look at
The number of ED visits for that population, we had the highest rate for ED visits and the second highest inpatient stays.
so we treated, so it's not that we have the most opioid incidents for population. I don't think we're not the top on that, are we?
We're the sixth highest in fatalities, I believe, seventh highest in fatalities.
But when you look at how we treat them, we are more likely to treat them in the emergency department than anybody else. Is that what that means?
Correct. And not only that, but we're also 1.5 times, our rate is 1.5 times higher, the second highest state. So we are not only leading country, but leading country
I think treat is maybe a questionable term here. This is where these individuals are seeking care. And on a per population basis, what this is saying is that we have, in 2014, we were number one in terms of the amount of people going to our emergency departments per, based on our population for opioid-related conditions.
Per 100,000.
Per 100,000.
Right.
So, I mean, the reason why I bring it up, I'm just trying to, and as I said, I should go back. I'm very conscious of this. We've just started one of the largest opioid research centers in the country at Brandeis. I'm becoming very much food sensitive, so I apologize. But I mean, it just hit me again, because I didn't know what it meant, and I didn't know whether that's a good or a bad thing. It may be, I mean, I think we need to be a little careful. I mean, is it to treating them in the emergency department as opposed to not treating them at all, or treating them someplace else? I don't know what that term in and of itself meant.
And I think I would echo your concern in the context of everything that else that's happening to prevent opioid abuse. And that is we want to encourage treatment and folks
That's
to
what I was
seek
thinking.
access.
So I think
And so where they're seeking it, and whether that needs to be, whether that access needs to be increased in the community, I think is the questions that some of this data might present. But I do think we need to be careful about how we are reading the data.
And we just know, Chairman and the Secretary, those are great points to be cautious. We often talk about inappropriate use of the ED, where patients don't have outpatient access and need to go to the ED. That could be a reason that incentives is still high for
I'm not questioning
veterans.
that,
So it could
but
be
it
a
may
good
be
thing.
that they're receiving no treatment in another, they're receiving treatment in the police department, so.
Right.
And again, I am surely not, I just didn't know what it meant and whether I should say, hey, that's a good thing, at least we're treating them.
Right.
But, okay, I'm willing to, given I'm hearing, that it's a problem here, but that there are other states where it's a percentage of their population even are high, and there are other states that aren't doing as much as we are. It's what Alice said, so what I can say.
Yeah, the other kind of caveat I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of here, this is data through 2015. So this is,
Yeah, I saw that too.
this is dating back a little bit. And certainly when we look and we think about some of the trends more recently, the impact of fentanyl on the opioid epidemic was really something that kicked in really at the end of 2015. So important for us to continue to track these trends moving forward. And I think reflecting that where can we best provide the care and treatment to these individuals, and also reflecting are these hospitals equipped to deal with the ever-increasing amount of patients that are arriving in the emergency departments, and how can we help support those hospitals in being able to connect the patients to treatment outside of the hospital, I think is another thing that this provides some insight on.
Actually, David, I was just thinking about that last point as I jumped ahead to the rate part, to the 2 slides forward, where it really looks like where our hospitals are is not where the biggest problem is. Right, so the bulk of our hospitals are in the Metro Boston area or other big cities, which and actually the rates are either highest or increasing the most in not the more rural areas, but also the smaller urban areas. So it really looks like an imbalance between facilities and people.
Probably caution against making a correlation just on the shady math, but yeah.
But just
This is also mapped by the patient zip code. We don't know where they saw care. Just flag that.
It also doesn't give you a sense of what the outpatient side of this looks like, or the community provider side.
Absolutely. This really just looks.
Well, have you given us a electro?
Another analysis we did is we looked at opioid, it's very hard to say, hospital opioid-related discharges by age group. We hear a lot in the media and through the literature that this epidemic is really affecting younger populations, and you can see that quite clearly here. Individuals between the ages of 20 and 44 comprised 30% of the Commonwealth's population, and yet they accounted for 70% of opioid-related hospital discharges. Here, the blue bar shows the rate in that age group in 2011. The orange bar shows the rate in that age group. The orange bar shows that rate in the age group in 2015. And you can see that there's been a shift in opioid-related hospital discharges from patients in their early 20s to patients in their late 20s and 30s. I think it's important to note that some age groups did see declines in the rate of opioid-related discharges. Children under 19 saw a 23% decline. And adults between the ages of 55 and 59 saw a 12% decrease. However, amongst that young adult population, there were substantial increases. Patients between the ages of 20 and 24 saw a 12% increase. Patients between the ages of 35 and 44 saw a 78% increase. And patients between the ages of 25 and 34 saw a striking 198% increase in opioid-related discharges during this time period. Finally, we also looked at opioid-related hospital discharges by HPC region. The blue shading shows the rate per 100,000 population in 2015. So the darker the blue, the higher the rate. As you can see here, the Berkshires, Metro South, and Fall River all had the highest rate of discharges. All of these communities had more than 1,300 discharges per 100,000 population. We overlaid that with the bars that show the growth in the rate of opioid-related hospital discharges between 2011 and 2015. I bring your attention to the red bars that denotes communities where the rate of opioid-related discharges more than doubled. So that would be the Upper North Shore, East Merrimack, Central Massachusetts, and the Cape and Island. As David mentioned, this is just a subset of all the analyses that we ran regarding the opioid epidemic and hospital utilization. So keep your eyes out for our chart back if you would like to see more.
Great, thank you, Tasha, Catherine, and the team. A lot of work goes into putting those maps together and doing these analyses, and I think we're excited to continue to add to the collective conversation around the Commonwealth's efforts on opioid epidemic. The rest of my slides are really just program updates across the certification and investment programs. Nothing that I feel pressingly that I need to review with you today. So I'm happy to yield the rest of my time to the chairman for final comments or questions or discussion.
Well, first of all, that's great stuff. And my question was not a criticism, it was just a question. As you said, there's a lot more to do. So, are there anybody, other commissioners want to say anything? David, I think this was a very important, very good meeting. And I think focusing on our strategic plans going forward, as Wendy and David pointed out, is extremely important. How we use our resources, how we impact on the system. We need to focus, but on the other hand, we need to be a beacon for these other areas like the opioid, even though others, like, really the primary responsibility for the opioid sits within the department. And the question is, Mary, Alice, how we can be helpful to your team and the ultimate responsibility, I would think, rests within the Department of Public Health and ourselves. But I'm sure our team is working with you.
Yeah, there has been collaboration. I think we can look at the statistics in the chart pack as they suggested and see what we can take from it and be cautious about what we
mine
can
is
take.
like a kid asking questions as opposed to the adult. Anybody?
Yeah, just on the opioid report and the heat maps, that's a great benefit to the community because it really gives you a picture of opioid use at a community level that you wouldn't get from just looking at the overdose numbers that come from DPH. So, and as you say, Foxborough, would have put Foxborough on the high end. So, just from a community planning and resource allocation point of view, that's a great resource. So, I just want to appreciate that.
I think the one other thing about it that's impressive is looking at the trends. And obviously you always have to say the trends just increased reporting and we're doing a better job of identifying people, or are they really, to what degree is it increased reporting, to what degree is it genuine increase? But those trends are heart-stopping. So there's the absolute numbers, and then there's looking at what's changed over time, and all of those lines are going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely. I mean, the trends are even more scary than when you look at those numbers and the fact that it's moving up in the age distribution, I think says a lot and not good in a way about what's happening. Anybody else want to jump in again? So David, our next meeting is
September 13th.
right. And again, David welcomes and I welcome any suggestions with respect to what we would hope that we would see in the cost trends hearings. I think what Wendy pointed out really deserves us to focus on, you know, how do we channel what we're talking about into those so that they reinforce each other. Right on. If I don't hear anything else, I think we stand adjourned. Thank you all for coming and enjoy the rest of the summer.
Yeah.